Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Casey Braun, and I'm the curator at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. I am so pleased that you could join us for today's presentation by Dr. Allison Martino. Dr. Martino's talk today marks the first program organized in conjunction with the exhibition Masks of Memories, Art and Ceremony in 19th Century Oceania, which is on view now at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. I encourage those attending today's virtual lecture to visit our galleries and experience the exhibition in person, and it will be open until July 9th. Now I'm delighted to introduce Allison Martino, who is joining us from Indiana University, Bloomington, where she serves as the Raymond and Laura Wielgus Curator of the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and Indigenous Art of the Americas at the Sydney and Lois Eskenazi Museum of Art. In this position, Dr. Martino oversees a collection of more than 4,000 works of art, pursues her research interests in textiles and fashion, photography, and contemporary arts in Africa, and serves as an affiliate faculty member in the African Studies program. Prior to her position at the Eskenazi Museum of Art, Dr. Martino received a BA from Denison University, an MA from Indiana University, and a PhD from the University of Michigan in the history of art. She then served as the 2018-2019 Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Africana Studies here at Bowdoin College, and the next year was named a Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. She co-curated 2 faculty and student exhibitions, Fashioning Modernity, Art and Independence Among Yorubas in Nigeria, and The Presence of the Past, Art from Central and West Africa. During her time at Bowdoin, she also curated Masks of Memories, which we're going to be discussing this afternoon. Other curatorial projects include Unrecorded, Reimagining Artist Identities in Africa, which was on view at the University of Michigan Museum of Art in 2018, and Youth Dancing in Joy, Photographs by Malik Sidibe, which the Eskenazi Museum of Art hosted in 2010. Dr. Martino's ongoing research into textiles and clothing in Ghana has been supported by fellowships and grants from Fulbright Hayes, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the University of Michigan. A recent article on Adinkra cloth was also awarded the Passold Research Fund's Passold Prize for the best article published in textile history in 2020. We are so lucky to have her with us today to share additional context behind the exhibition Masks of Memories. She's going to speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll welcome questions from the audience. And I did just want to say a quick note that we are recording today's session. Without further ado, I am delighted to turn the program over to Allison Martino. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you so much, Cassie, for that very warm introduction and for inviting me to speak today. I'm very happy to be with you, at least virtually, to be back with the Bowdoin and Brunswick community. I'm just going to share my screen. So I will be speaking today, as Casey mentioned, on the exhibition Masks of Memories that just opened in the museum's Markel Gallery. And I will say, as I'm getting started, that I am getting over a cold right now, so please bear with me while I was speaking this afternoon. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University Bloomington is built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. We are dedicated to centering Indigenous voices and perspectives, improving community relationships, and making the Indiana University Bloomington campus a more supportive and inclusive place for Native and Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. As Casey mentioned, I curated this exhibition, Masks of Memories, Art and Ceremony in 19th Century Oceania, during a postdoctoral fellowship at the museum that I completed in 2020. I want to extend my sincerest thanks and gratitude to the entire staff at the museum, especially the museum's co-directors, Anne and Frank Goodyear, for their support of this project and their guidance throughout my fellowship at the museum. My experience at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, which I often refer to as the BCMA, during my postdoc was extremely fruitful for the curatorial work that I'm continuing to do today, and I'm very grateful for the museum's willingness to support my research interests during that fellowship position. I also want to thank Marika van der Steenhoven at the Bowdoin Library Special Collection for her assistance with my research on this project, along with the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath that also facilitated my research. Today, I will present an introduction to this exhibition, Masks of Memories, and discuss how these works on view from New Ireland demonstrate connections between Oceania and Maine. In doing so, we will talk about provenance, which is the ownership history of an artwork and an important issue in the museum world today. This project began because the museum holds 8 masks that date to the 19th century from New Ireland, which is a province in Papua New Guinea, and one of those masks is pictured here on the left. This area is in Oceania, a region that is sometimes referred to as the South Pacific and includes places like Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. These masks, along with the sculpture from New Ireland, are the only artworks from Oceania that are in the museum's collection. Masks like these would have been worn during funerary ceremonies among Northern New Irelanders. Malagan is the name attributed to both these funerary ceremonies and the objects used within them, including masks like this one that would have been danced in a commemorative performance, as well as figurative sculptures and memorial friezes. So these masks are generally referred to as malagan masks, and some of these masks also carry more specific names depending on their visual form. So this one that is pictured here is called tatsanua, and this style of mask is most characteristic with the form of the headdress having a very tall, rounded shape to it. And this is actually the same mask that you're looking at here, but 2 sides of it. So each side looks quite different. The exhibition explores these masks in relation to ideas about memory and ephemerality. And I'll discuss both of those topics later on today. I came to this project and studying the masks through my work as an Africanist. My research largely focuses on African arts, especially textiles and dress practices. And during my postdoc at Bowdoin, as you heard, I co-curated with David Gordon, the professor of history at Bowdoin, and students in his class, the prior exhibition on view in the Markel Gallery called The Presence of the Past that presented both historical and contemporary works from Central and West Africa. However, my early interest in studying art history actually included oceanic arts, and learning that the museum's collection held these masks sparked renewed interest for me to research oceanic artworks. I learned that a few of these works from New Ireland had been on view several years ago alongside works from other collection areas, but that there had not been an exhibition dedicated specifically to these masks. Now, it's not uncommon for masks like this one to be in museum collections located in the US and in other parts of the global north. But what was particularly unusual is that they entered the BCMA's collection over 120 years ago in 1898. This makes them among the earliest malagan objects to enter an art museum collection in the United States. My research centered on exploring this history to better understand how and why these masks came to Bowdoin in the late 19th century. The museum received these masks together as a gift from Harold Marsh Sewell in 1898. And after I share an overview of the exhibition, I will return to their provenance to Sewell and explore his connections to Maine, including Bowdoin, and Oceania during the late 19th century. The exhibition is organized into 3 thematic sections focused on topics of creating, performing, and collecting. The first 2 on production and performance center on the malagan masks. The later section on collecting also includes artworks in the museum's collection by Europeans that are based on artists' travels in Oceania and present foreigners' views of this region. Inclusion of these European artworks seeks to contextualize the malagan masks with how ideas of Oceania circulated in the global north during the 19th century when these masks were made. It offers us a wider view about ideas of the South Pacific that were part of the European and also American imagination during this time when the masks were collected. I organized the exhibition into these sections because I wanted to bring attention to both the cultural significance of the masks and also the related collecting practices to consider how and why objects like these became part of US museum collections. I'll briefly introduce here the ideas presented in each of the 3 exhibition sections and then move on to discussing the work's provenance connections to Maine. The section on creating brings attention to the process of making malagan masks. This photograph here shows one of the masks displayed in the section of the exhibition. And again, you're seeing one mask here, but 2 views of it. So this is rather common with the masks that are in the collection, particularly for the Tatanua mask, that each side of the mask looks different. Production of these masks is gendered, in which men carve the masks from wood. And malagan masks generally represent men as well. Some malagan masks with a tall fiber crest, such as this one pictured here that is common to this Tatanua style, depicts a men's mourning hairstyle, in which we can make a connection between what's selected for the imagery depicted on the mask and its use at a funerary ceremony. People commission carvers to make malagan masks for their use in these ceremonies. And these individuals who commission the masks have also sometimes contributed to the production process, as they can be the ones to add the painted imagery onto the wood surface. The makers then of a single mask are thus multiple and can vary widely in terms of their skills, expertise, and training. The exhibition's title, Masks of Memories, is tied to the production and process of making malagan masks. Carvers use their memories of past masks to create new ones. They draw upon their memories of the masks as well as their clients' memories, rather than consulting or looking at them directly, because people did not keep malagan masks after the funerals ended. Rather, they discarded them. But before the masks are discarded, the men who want to commission carvers to make new masks buy the rights to the imagery depicted in a previous mask that they saw. This involves a very complex system involving copyright and image permissions that I won't go into detail on today, but I hope it suffices here to understand this general process of discard and relying on memories to create new works. We unfortunately do not know the names of the carvers who made the malagan masks in the museum's collection, nor the names of the people who commissioned them. And this absence reflects a widespread challenge with oceanic arts collections in museums today, and is not at all specific to these masks or to Bowdoin's collection. Until around the mid-20th century, it was very common for collectors and dealers who often came from the global north to not document artists' names because they did not view these makers as artists. Instead, Europeans and Americans often viewed such works as artifacts or as ethnographic objects that changed what information they recorded or didn't record about the objects. Still today, scholarship on malagan has not brought much attention to individual artists who make malagan objects. Another related challenge that I want to acknowledge here is that the only person connected to these masks that we know by name is the former owner, Harold Marsh Sewell. This is all too common with art collections from Oceania and other parts of the global South, where we often know more about the people who collected the works, who are often white men from Europe and America, than we do about the people who made and used these objects and really gave them their personal and cultural significance. The section of the exhibition on performing considers how people have used malagan masks at funerals in New Ireland. As I mentioned earlier, malagan is also the name of the funerary ceremony, so both the name of the kinds of objects that were used in these events and the names to refer to the events themselves. These events are very important for both honoring the deceased and also the living relatives. And these funerals are often comprised of several different ceremonies that can span multiple years in time. And the ones with the kinds of masks that are on view in the exhibition usually appear during the final ceremony for a funeral. Communities in several parts of Northern New Ireland have held malagan ceremonies, and some oral histories recall that malagan ceremonies began in one of the neighboring islands. The masks on view here really only offer us a partial and fragmentary view into these funerary ceremonies. The masks would not have appeared alone, but as part of a dancer's full ensemble, where their clothes and accessories would complement the mask. And the museum's collection includes one malagan object that is not a mask. It is this sculpture here that takes the form of a bird. A performer likely would have used something like this as a mouthpiece during a performance that is indicated in this extension from the back of the bird. This mouthpiece came from the same donor as the masks, but we do not know yet if it would have been used in conjunction with any of the specific masks that are now in the museum's collection, or if it would have been used separately with other kinds of malagan masks and objects. For the museum to mainly only have malagan masks now is quite common. Masks became the collectible item from these performances. And this is also not limited to malagan practices, but is especially common with oceanic art collections. Funerary performances were with malagan masks were multisensorial. So I want to at least acknowledge here that the audiences encountering these masks during the performances would have also experienced music, dancing, and displays of other kinds of malagan objects as well. The third section of the exhibition on collecting brings attention to prints in the museum's collection by the French artist Charles Maron, who worked in Paris during the mid-19th century and made works about his travels in Oceania with the French Navy that spanned from 1842 to 1846. He also traveled to other parts of the world while he was with the Navy before and visiting Oceania. And upon returning to France, he began to work more as an artist and became best known for his work in etchings. And you see one example of his work here that is also on view in the exhibition. These artworks by Maron that are on view in this exhibition are not directly related to the malagan masks, but instead offer a wider view on the circulation of imagery about Oceania during the mid to late 19th century. I'm not aware of any direct connections between Maron's work and malagan practices, but Maron's work does show us one perspective of how Europeans perceived Oceania during this time, what he observed and encountered, and how he translated those experiences visually through his drawings and later etchings. And like him, other European and American artists also visited Oceania during this period and created artworks that depicted these lands and its peoples and practices. Included in this section of the exhibition are etchings that Maron made between 1844 and 1866. They include ones like the one pictured here that illustrate seaside landscapes of different places, including New Zealand, as well as islands in Micronesia and Polynesia. For reference, Oceania is largely organized into three major regions: Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, that you may have heard me refer to already. Polynesia includes places like Hawaii, New Zealand, and Samoa, whereas places like the Marshall Islands is in Micronesia, which is located to the west of Polynesia. And Melanesia includes places like Fiji and New Guinea, among many other islands. And Maron made drawings during his travels to some of these places, and they then became the basis for the etchings that he later made upon returning to France. A particularly interesting etching in the museum's collection that Raymond made departs from these landscape scenes of places in Oceania to include a blending of French and Oceanic imagery. In Raymond's larger oeuvre, he often made works about France. And here he depicts a school in Paris. And if you look closely at this print, you will find that he incorporates imagery from Oceania as well. Specifically, there's a person standing on a boat that I've highlighted in red here, and that is shown with a mask resembling those from New Caledonia, which is an area in Melanesia where Raymond visited during his travels in Oceania. And I encourage you to look for this in person if you are able to visit the exhibition at the museum and see these works in person, where you can see that detail on the mask more clearly. But even here, you can gather when looking at the larger work that the size and placement of this mask in this etching of the school is rather subtle. It's not front and center to get the viewer's attention, but its inclusion suggests how his travels to Oceania continue to impact his work and the way he was representing France in his work as well. And including Charles Mayrand's work in the thematic section of the exhibition on collecting seeks to demonstrate how Europeans viewed and reinterpreted their experiences in Oceania during the 19th century. And this leads us to thinking specifically about how the malagan masks in this exhibition were collected by the end of the 19th century. As I mentioned earlier, Harold Marsh Sewell donated these masks to Bowdoin in 1898. We unfortunately do not yet know when or how Sewell acquired the masks that he then donated to the museum. But Sewell's work and his family's business offers insights onto Sewell's multiple connections to Oceania that suggest some possibilities for how he might have acquired these masks. When Sewell donated the works from New Ireland to Bowdoin, he was serving as US Minister to Hawaii, a position that he held from 1897 until 1900. Prior to his appointment in Hawaii, he served as US Vice Consul in Liverpool, England, from 1885 to 1887. Before he was appointed US Consul General to Samoa from 1887 to 1892. And following that position, he practiced law in Bath, Maine from 1892 until 1897, when he then moved to Honolulu, Hawaii. My suggestion here is that Sewell likely acquired the objects through his diplomatic posts, most likely through his position in Samoa. I've not yet learned in my research on Sewell if he ever traveled to New Ireland while he was based in Samoa and could have purchased the mask there, or how widely he may have traveled while he was in Samoa to other places in Oceania or within Melanesia more specifically. It's also unclear if he could have also received the masks as a gift while he was working in Samoa. Some other things that we still do not know was how soon after Sewell acquired the masks that he decided to then donate them to Bowdoin's museum. But when Sewell served in Samoa, it was becoming more common for masks to be sold to foreigners. And that's something I will turn to in a moment. For those of you in the audience that are from Maine, you may be familiar with the Sewell name. Sewell's family was from Bath, Maine. And the Sewell family was well known for its work in Maine's shipbuilding industry during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Sewell ships built in Bath traveled around the world and participated in global trade. The family business provided another possible avenue through which Sewell could have acquired objects from Oceania. Sewell ships sailed extensively. In my research thus far of the Sewell family business archives that are now held at the Maine Maritime Museum, I learned that Sewell ships traveled to places including Hawaii, which was a part of the sugar trade during the 19th century. Sewell ships also traveled through Australia and the Solomon Islands in the late 19th century, and New Caledonia and Melanesia in the early 20th century. Further research may reveal that other Sewell ships also sailed to other destinations in Oceania during that time. Archival records also revealed that some Sewell ships were given names reflecting references to Oceania. For example, a Sewell vessel launched in 1889 was named Tulufa, which means hello in Samoan, and another Sewell vessel launched in 1891 was named Tofa, meaning goodbye in Samoan. Attributing these vessels names in Samoan language could have been connected to Harold's post in Samoa, as both vessels were built while he was serving as U.S. Consul General to Samoa. This information on the Sewell ships comes from the family papers that are now held at the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath. And the museum also holds there, the Maine Maritime Museum also holds Harold Sewell's paper within this larger archive on the Sewell family. In addition to these holdings, the Maine Maritime Museum was previously located in Harold Sewell's former home in Bath during the 1960s, which his daughter had gifted to the museum. Harold Sewell and his family donated objects to other museum collections within the United States, including the United States National Museum, which is now part of the Anthropology and Ethnology collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Sewell's wife, Camilla, donated around 200 objects from Oceania to the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts as well. And that collection includes works from Samoa, where Sewell was based, as well as objects from other places in Oceania, including New Ireland and the Solomon Islands. It is not clear exactly what prompted Sewell to donate these works to Bowdoin's museum, but Sewell and his family had links to Bowdoin College that offer some insights as to why Sewell may have decided to donate the artworks to Bowdoin. Sewell himself had earned degrees at Harvard University, but he later received an honorary degree from Bowdoin College in 1919, just over 20 years after he donated the malagan artworks to the museum. At the time that Sewell made the donation to the museum, the Sewell family had already established other connections to Bowdoin College. One of the Sewell family members was a trustee and treasurer from in the early 1800s, and at least 5 family members had graduated from Bowdoin College in the 19th century before Harold Sewell donated the objects in 1898. A few of the Sewell family members were also professors at Bowdoin, and 2 of Harold's children studied at Bowdoin in the early 20th century. Now, I want to go back to this process of making malagan masks that I spoke about earlier in the presentation. I discussed how carvers create the masks from their memories of past ones, because people did not keep the masks for carvers to later have as a reference for making future ones. The usefulness of the masks ended after the performance ended, and they were not valued as objects to be kept. Rather, people discarded them. Sometimes they would be left in forests to decay. Sometimes they may have been burned. For malagan masks from the 19th century to remain today, not only in Bowdoin's collection, but in other collections as well, raises important questions about ephemerality and permanence and what it means for these masks to still exist today. These masks thus raise interesting points for discussion about how museum collections care for artworks that were designed to be ephemeral and not preserved over time. What is also important to note here is that malagan masks in museums often entered these collections because New Irelanders sold them to foreigners visiting New Ireland. People in New Ireland noticed a market for these kinds of objects. The foreigners were interested in these masks. Selling them became another way of discarding the masks from their lives. I will briefly acknowledge here that there were some kinds of malagan masks that New Irelanders found culturally inappropriate to be kept, and those masks were not sold, but rather properly discarded according to their cultural practices. This distinction suggests how New Irelanders were selective of what objects they sold to foreigners. Anthropologist Afra Gell explains further on this idea. And Gell says, quote, "Being sold off for cash is the final death of objects of this type, and has been since the latter decades of the 19th century. Conceptually, from the New Ireland point of view, a malagan carving, which has fulfilled its ritual role, has rotted away and is no more, and its future as a museum piece is irrelevant," end quote. Gell's explanation here shows how New Irelanders viewed the selling of malagan masks as a form of discard, and thus was not viewed as culturally inappropriate for people and institutions, including foreigners and museums, to keep these objects for a longer life. Foreign collecting interests in objects associated with malagan in New Ireland began during the mid to late 19th century. It coincided with wider collecting interests in oceanic arts among people in the global north. During this time, people often collected masks and sculptures that were framed under the larger category of what was then called primitive arts. Europeans and Americans applied this problematic term to objects collected from areas outside of the global north, especially Oceania, as well as Africa and South and Central America, which aligned with misperceptions of these places and cultures that circulated in the global north. Primitive arts were inaccurately framed as artistic and cultural practices that were timeless, devoid of technological advancement, sophistication, or outside influence. Collecting interests in malagan objects from New Ireland also intersected with increased travel to Oceania among Europeans and Americans, including trips for missionary work and a growing colonial presence in the region as well. Missionaries in New Ireland, including Methodist and Catholic missionaries, date to around the late 19th century. When Sewell donated the masks to Bowdoin in 1898, New Ireland was under the establishment of German colonial rule that ran from 1885 until 1914. These early collecting strategies in Oceania are also reflected in the kinds of cultural institutions that often hold malagan objects from New Ireland. Museums associated with natural history, ethnology, and anthropology became the first museum homes for these kinds of objects because collectors and curators during the 19th century often associated such works more as artifacts and ethnographic objects. And malagan has also primarily been studied among anthropologists rather than scholars in other disciplines, including art history. This relates to my earlier discussion about the absence of carver names because these objects were not recognized at that time as artworks. Over time, interpretations of such objects among collectors and curators shifted, and their placement within collections expanded to also be included in art museum collections. Bowdoin's holdings of malagan masks from New Ireland is exceptional in that it is among the earliest examples of such masks to enter an art museum collection in the 19th century in the United States. It was more common for natural history and ethnology collections in the US to acquire malagan masks during the 19th century. Malagan masks and other objects associated with malagan ceremonies generally entered art museum collections in the United States during the 20th century. Placing the masks within an art museum collection resulted in presenting different narratives and display strategies than how the same kinds of objects could appear in ethnographic collections and galleries. In thinking about this broader context of how malagan objects ended up in museums located in the global north, let's now turn specifically to what it meant for Bowdoin to acquire these masks in 1898. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Bowdoin College also had an anthropology collection, which was located in the Sarah Science Building on campus, and an earlier photograph of that space is pictured here. In my archival research on campus, I learned that Sewell loaned to Bowdoin College some other objects from Oceania that were kept within this anthropology collection on campus. When Sewell donated the New Ireland artworks to the museum in 1898, this was just 4 years after the Walker Art Building, the museum's first building that continues to house the museum today, had opened in 1894. This postcard photograph of an installation at the Walker Art Gallery that was possibly taken between 1900 and 1910 reveals the gallery's general approach to displaying artworks during that time. Sisters Harriet and Sophia Walker, who championed the museum's early work, were interested in building an encyclopedic collection. Acquiring these malagan objects thus supported the museum's early interest in collecting art from across the world. Yet works like these malagan masks were filtered through Euro-American interests in other parts of the globe. In other words, the inclusion of the malagan masks in the museum's collection are as much about Europe and America as they are about New Ireland. Then this selection tells us about some of their interests in thinking about what was included and represented in museum collections. In another postcard photograph taken from around 1900, we see examples of how other kinds of more world art was being displayed in the Walker Art Gallery during this time, where there are some works from Oceania that are displayed on the left wall. And in some of the research that I was able to do reviewing some of the archival materials on campus, it seems that Sewell had donated other objects from Oceania to Bowdoin, and that those may have been the ones either displayed here or displayed elsewhere during this time as well. And I share a few of these examples from the earlier displays at the museum dating back to the early 19th century to provide some context on how these works from the collection were being exhibited when these masks would have first entered into the collection during the late 19th century. They also seek to demonstrate the Walker's early vision for an encyclopedic collection, as well as the relationship between art and anthropological collections, given that Bowdoin also had a separate anthropology collection alongside the art museum's collection as well. And I think that these malagan masks from New Ireland provide an important avenue for us to explore these issues in terms of representation within museum collections, both historically and still today, as well as really important and interesting topics around ephemerality and memory, specific to malagan practices of how these works were made and used and given meaning among Northern New Irelanders. And in presenting some of the provenance research on the masks in relation to Harold Sewell, I hope that looking at this ownership history and Sewell's connections to Bowdoin and also Oceania offers more insights on how and why these masks came into the collection. Though we still have a lot of unanswered questions, that provides some avenues, I think, for future research to continue provenance work to better understand the history of these masks prior to them coming into the museum. But from what we know thus far, the masks in the museum collection tell us an important story about 19th century connections between Oceania and Maine specifically. Thank you so much for your time today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about this exhibition.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was really fantastic. We do have a couple of questions starting to come in through the Q&A. So I would invite anyone who has a question for Allison to type your question there. We will see it and we will try to get through it. But as people are giving things some thought, I might I was just curious to open with a more general question. You and I, share some similarities as museum curators. My focus has been Native American art, but I've also done work with African collections. And I really appreciated how your presentation today really addressed provenance and the history of collecting practices in the 19th century. And you took us on this great deep dive with regard to the malagan masks. I'm just curious, as an Africanist who is also clearly conducting research on other parts of the global South and the colonized world, have you noticed any broad similarities or differences in the ways that African and Oceanic works are entering collections? Are there differences in the conversations that are happening today with respect to how museums can best steward these objects for the many audiences who come to experience them?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And it's interesting too, because my position now at the Eskenazi Museum of Art at Indiana University includes working with a larger department that includes African art, Oceanic art, and Indigenous art of the Americas. So while my research has primarily focused on African art, I'm grappling with these issues across the board for these three collection areas. And I think in some ways, the bigger issues that I'm grappling with resonate across the three collection areas. So, and in this case, between Oceania and African art collections, I think the bigger issues resonate across the board, and the challenges that I'm facing with doing provenance research. I think there are some similarities, generally speaking. And then certainly there's always going to be those case by case differences, but I don't know if they're necessarily geographically Africa specific or Oceania specific.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate the challenge of trying to work across, so much of the world. We do have some more specific questions that have come in about the masks in particular. One question was, were the particular masks created and used exclusively by men? And were there comparable masks or rituals associated with women in New Ireland at this time?
Yeah, that's a good question. My understanding is that they were primarily made by men. There could certainly be exceptions to that, so often with these gender norms and artistic practices, there can be common trends of something being most often made among women or men, but there's often cases exceptions to that and people challenging those ideas over time. But my understanding is that carving of the masks was primarily among men, and that oftentimes the people who would commission the masks would be men as well. But it does seem that women would be involved in other aspects of the larger ceremonies and events that these objects would have appeared within. So there may have been other parts of the ceremonies that women would have a stronger role in, but these kinds of objects, as I understand it, were primarily included work among men. I'm not familiar with comparable masks that would have been made primarily by women. That I would need to look into more within New Ireland.
Thank you. Another more specific, and I might actually combine two questions into one here. The first was a lot of the images that you showed, and this is coming from Caroline de Mauriac. A lot of the images that you showed points out the stark difference between the two sides of the mask. And she was wondering, could you talk a little bit more about the significance of that? And sort of a follow-up, is there a continuity of any of these masking practices extending into the more recent past or even modern eras?
Yeah, that's a great question. I unfortunately don't know the answer to the first question about the two sides of the mask. It was something I really was curious in, because if you would only see a picture of one side of the mask, and then you would separately see the second picture, you wouldn't think, or at least I didn't think it was the same mask, right? That they really do look very different. But I'm not, I don't yet know what the reasoning is for having such different imagery on other sides, on either of the two sides. I have been interested in sort of the second question about continuity of these practices over time. And I will say I was not able to do any field research for this project, and I have not traveled to New Ireland. So my view on this is coming from a very different perspective and really drawing upon secondary research that other scholars have done on this within the field. But I did come across some examples, the details are escaping my mind at the moment, of malagan masks in some ways being reimagined now for festivals and events that are more geared towards the tourism industry, and some things I had come across online when I was just looking into seeing what was happening today. But that I think would require some further looking into to see how common that's being practiced today. But it did sort of suggest to me that there may be some presence of it, even if it looks quite different than it did in the 19th and early 20th century.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Professor David Gordon. He says, great talk. I was so surprised by the early date of Sewell's collection and that it went to the BCMA, the Museum of Art, and not the anthropology department, which says a lot about the nature of collecting at Bowdoin. I was also surprised at the extent of the Sewell collection donated to so many museums. What motivated his collection of these objects in your view? And is there any evidence of his interests perhaps in the archives?
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you for joining today, and thank you for your question. I was also really interested in the fact that what David pointed out, that it came to the art museum rather than the anthropology department because of this common practice during the late 19th century and the early 20th century that these kinds of objects were associated more within anthropological collections. And this question about what motivated his collecting more broadly is a big question that I still have. In the archival research that I've done and reading on secondary literature about Harold Sewell, I have found no mention of collecting and interest in the arts broadly even. So that's been a very big question for me of why did he collect these objects? Were there things that he sought out while he was traveling? Were they gifts that he received? Those are still big questions that I have. Yeah. But I think there's a lot of potential for future research, particularly with the Maine Maritime Museum, that they hold the Sewell family papers there, that I was doing some of this work during spring 2020 at the end of my postdoc at Bowdoin, which was the start of the pandemic. And so in-person access to materials was very limited. So I wasn't able to do the in-person research that I had hoped to do at the Maine Maritime Museum. So I think there could be information there that would answer these questions. Yeah.
Well, we'd love to have you back for a research visit,
Yeah.
and you can come visit the Maritime Museum.
Yeah.
We have a question from Ann Collins Goodyear, and she says, it's great to see you. Do you think that these masks were most likely acquired by gift or purchase? To what degree do these gifts help us to understand the nature of Sewell's relationships to the communities that he may have been visiting?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. That's a great question. And again, I don't have any indication from the research that I had started on this work if he even received other gifts. That was a question I had. Even if we can't find the specifics on these masks, can we get some indication? I mentioned earlier in the talk that he had held several posts between Liverpool, Samoa, Hawaii, that he was very international in the work that he was doing. And I was just interested in finding out, was part of those positions, did he often receive gifts, or was he collecting things from other places as well? And I still don't know the answer to those questions. But generally, for the malagan masks, it was becoming more common at the time that he was in Samoa for foreigners to purchase the masks. So I think that is a possibility that he could have purchased a mask. And I don't know that he traveled to New Ireland, but in general, that was something that was happening, that these masks are being sold to foreigners. So at least knowing that much provides some insight. And the fact that it was culturally acceptable for those masks to be sold, I think was important to me to understand that component, that they were comfortable with those masks leaving New Ireland and going on to have other homes in other places.
Thank you. There's a great question, I think, here that really connects to the themes of ephemerality and memory that you drew out, and that is just, can you talk more about the process of securing the rights to the mask imagery that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you know, and a little bit more about what that process might have looked like based on your research?
Yeah. So my understanding for this is that this started often among the person who would be interested in commissioning the masks, that they would be observing other masks being performed or being present in some of the funerary ceremonies and would seek out ones that they were interested in to have made in the future, and that they would negotiate with individuals the rights that they could use those designs again in a future mask. Some things that I'm still unclear of how it worked is then how they then relayed to the maker those designs of the mask, because I think that my impression is that it would have been a combination of drawing upon the memories that carvers had of past masks, but also the specific imagery from the person who had commissioned the rights. So how they sort of relayed those details is something that I was really interested in, of what strategies they were using to recall that information later on to then make the mask, is something that I was particularly interested in. And there have been, if this is a topic that anyone's interested in, there have been some scholars that have done much more extensive research on this topic around copyright related to the mask that I recommend looking into as well.
I think that's fascinating. I don't generally think about copyright with, you know, respect to art like this. And I was just wondering
too, oh, I was just going to say, I don't know if, you know, as scholars have used the term copyright, I don't know if the people within these communities in New Ireland were using the term copyright in the way that we think of copyright,
right.
But a way of thinking about these designs being ones that a particular maker created, and that seeking permission to use those designs or using them as inspiration for future designs, right? So some of those foundational ideas are there, but I don't know if the way they were interpreting copyright is the same we may think of copyright in the US today.
Well, and I think that kind of raised another broad question for me. Obviously, you drew out so beautifully the way that these masks were conceived, created, and treated. You know, they were made based on memory and through face-to-face conversations, and then were discarded or left to degrade. I mean, that's such a strong contrast to our roles as museum professionals, where our role really is to document and to conserve in perpetuity. So I was just curious if, you know, you could share a little bit of your thoughts as a curator about how you navigate some of these tensions or differences with the works of art that you steward.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I've thought quite often about in working on this project, how interesting it was that these objects were never meant to be kept. And here they are all of these years later. And, you know, so much of museum work is centered around preservation and care for these objects, right? And that the makers and users of these objects were not thinking about that at all. And my perspective often on these kinds of topics is to defer to the people who had made and used these objects, of what their preferences are for how these objects are cared for in the future, and what that would look like for museums to become stewards of those objects. You know, in my secondary research on this material, there seems to be discussion that New Irelanders were comfortable with selling these objects, knowing that they were going to be kept. I think if there was discrepancy there and they were not comfortable with these objects being kept, that would raise a very different set of questions to me. But if they viewed the selling as a form of discard, then it almost makes me wonder if this is the start of another life, so to speak, for the object, that it had one life when it was being made and used within these communities. and their purpose ended at the end of that ceremony, and now it's going on to start a new life in a way within these museums. But it does raise such interesting questions about how conservators especially would work on objects that were designed to be ephemeral. And even the materials themselves, how much we work on the materials that may be more ephemeral than others.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, we are just about at time. So I would like to just extend my thanks for delivering such a wonderful presentation about this exhibition. Again, for those of you who are here, please come see it at the museum. It's in the Markel Gallery. But I guess I'm the only one on the screen, but I'm going to clap and say thank you so much, Allison, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you so much, Casey. And thank you so much to all of you joining virtually. And it's really wonderful to at least see so many familiar faces virtually in the audience from Bowdoin.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.